Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 9 o'clock. My name is Chris Weuve, and this is Starfleet Tactical. Thank you very much for joining us, as always. So last week, I didn't immediately show everybody what shirt I was wearing, and so as a result, I had to stop in the middle of the talk. So let me go ahead. This is the other Bu9 shirt that I own. I own a gray one and a black one. I think I said last week that I was probably going to wear the black one this week, and so I am. Okay, so let's see. Lissa's in the background, so everybody wave to Lissa. And so this week we're going to do a follow-on to last week, which was a follow-on, or last episode, which was a follow-on to the episode, not the one right immediately before that, but the one before that. We're going to talk about Michael McCollum's Antares Trilogy. And specifically, we're going to talk about the doctrine and combat stuff. And I probably should have just said strategy and tactics. That probably works a little better than that. But this is a follow-on. This is one of my this is one of my all-time favorite series. I really like it, and so I'm going to, you know, there's places where I'm going to suggest things that I think would be an improvement, or, you know, changes that could be made if he was going to do another edition or something like that. I really want to emphasize the fact that this is one of my favorite series, and the reason why I spent so much time thinking about it, going through it, is because it's got such potential, and I like it so much that it's worth me sort of tearing it apart. I don't waste time on things I don't care about. Or even with some things I do care about. You know, when I watch the original Star Wars movie, I'm 12 again, but I don't spend any time analyzing it because I just don't think it's worth analyzing. So, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. But first, the obligatory admin announcement slide. So it is unclear as to whether I will be available on the 18th of April because my sister and her wife are coming to town, and as a result of that, I may be busy that night because that might be the only night we have to get together during the time that they're in town. But other than that, I'm expecting it to be a yes for April. The 2nd of May is a hard no because I'm off gaming with some people, and I don't expect to be back in time. And even if I was, I'll be pretty tired by the end of the day. I'm expecting the rest of May through the 23rd to be probably, there's a possibility I may go visit some friends in Norfolk at some point during that time, and I may not be available. But it's unclear as to how that's going to work out. Well, I'll have to wait and see. And then the 30th of May is probably a no because I'm trying to go to Wonderfest, but we haven't quite made that work yet. One of these days we will. And hopefully we'll be able to make that work. But as always, these are my opinions, not the opinions of any employer. Any images I've included are for purposes of critique and education. And nothing I say should prevent you from enjoying anything that you currently enjoy. And I think I added something. I added specifically something that I frequently say, but I don't think was on the caveat list, which is that this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. So that's one of the reasons why I keep coming back to stuff, right? Is because I discover I have more to say on it. And so, you know, I expect that like next week, I think I'm going to do a show on modularity again, because there's some new stuff to be said on that. And so the plan is for Chris to come on the show, and Chris Carlson to come on the show, and we're going to talk about modularity again. Okay, so here's the agenda for this evening. I'm going to go through a few things. I rewatched the show this afternoon, and I realized that there's a few places where it seemed clear to me at the time when I was giving the synopsis, etc. And then later, when I rewatched it, it's like I like forgot to explain an important part of that. You know, so I made an assumption that people knew, or I just thought I had explained it and I didn't. I am going to do a little bit more explanation on stuff. I'm going to revisit some of the slides I did and add some stuff to it. That's going to be the technology, the spacecraft, and the synopsis slides. I'm going to add a what's missing things that I think would, from a technology standpoint, would have made sense to put in there. And then I'm going to go on and talk some about fold space and fold points and how all that fits together, and then how that affects strategy and tactics. And then I'm going to do the strategic plan and the tactical plan. And then I'm going to talk about one possible solution, I think, that would have made it better, which is having battle riders in this series, because it kind of makes sense. And I'll talk about that. And the part that's peeking up from the bottom, because I should have changed the font because it scrolled off the bottom of the screen, is just saying next episode. So then I'll talk a little bit about where I think it's going to go next, what I'm planning on doing next week and stuff like that. Okay, so let me take a quick look. Wright is tagging in just long enough to say that he's not going to be there, because Wright actually has a part-time job where he works at a theater, and he frequently does stuff there. And I think he even pointed it out to me when I was down there visiting, because I used to go down there for work and I'd get together with Wright. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about technology. So I talked about how there's no artificial gravity inertial compensators or anything like that. So when they accelerate, they're pushed back into their seat, they are subjected to G-force. They have to spin the ship in order to get centrifugal force in order to make their own gravity. That continues to be the case. The photon drives that they use, they say they're limited to 1 G without boosting, but they'll like throw plasma into the exhaust. I'm not sure that works with a photon drive, but okay, I'll press the I believe button on that. And when they do that, they can get a couple of G's out of it, although there's a ship later on which gets way more than that. And so I kind of wonder, I'm not sure whether Mr. McCollum fully tracked the limitations that he was putting upon himself when he initially described the drive. I'm not sure that he was tracking those limitations later on when he invented new stuff. It's all fusion power. They talk about lasers and missiles and antimatter projectors. That's the only time you hear antimatter mentioned. That and antimatter bombs. They do have antimatter bombs that they use for clearing fold points. But they don't apparently use antimatter for power at all. You have anti-radiation shields that at one point are described as nearly perfect reflectors of electromagnetic radiation. I would think those would be useful in combat if you're dealing with lasers and nuclear-armed missiles. I would think a nearly perfect reflector of electromagnetic radiation could potentially be useful. Never mentioned as being used in combat. Once they get through the Antares Nebula, that's the only thing they use them for. There's cloud armor, which is basically like sandcasters or screens from Traveler 2300, sandcasters from Traveler, which is basically refractive particles that are spread out that are used to refract laser beams. So, and sort of they're ablative refractive particles, and they absorb laser fire and diffuse it. The armor itself has particles like that sort of built into the armor. So as the armor sort of ablates away, it fills the space with a bunch of reflective glass particles that will cause diffusion. So it's harder to chew through the armor with your laser. And then they talk about planetary defense centers, which are basically emplacements with large lasers. Okay, ship types. I talked about some of these last time. I think I forgot to put in destroyers. I forgot that he specifically talks about heavy battle cruisers. He doesn't talk about heavy cruisers. He talks about heavy battle cruisers. He doesn't talk about light battle cruisers. He talks about light cruisers in there, but he talks about heavy battle cruisers. And the battle cruiser, there was a squadron of 3 battle cruisers that got stranded in Alton space when the fold space point went away. And they are described in the first book as being Derringer class battle cruisers, and in the second or third book, I think second book, as being Dragon class battle cruisers. So I think he just remembered it started with a D and forgot which one he had put down or something like that. I don't know. But in any event, so it's unclear as to what class they are, either Derringer or Dragon. There's tankers, and one thing that's sort of important about this is that he says at one point that a fold space jump uses 10% of the ship's fuel. There's no other qualifiers. So which ship? Presumably ships have different size fuel tanks. Presumably, you know, like, okay, if you've got a ship that has otherwise identical ship, but one only has, you know, one fuel tank, the other one has two. I mean, it's unclear as to exactly how to process that. And then plus you use fuel when you're moving around in system. It was specifically explaining to a civilian that 10% doesn't mean that you can do 10 jumps, because you do have to move around in system, et cetera, et cetera. So my guess is that's probably a rule of thumb. It probably is something that might vary depending upon ship class. These are the sorts of rules of thumb that you know about individual ships. This is how you do stuff. And so it's probably something like that. But that 10% is kind of important. I'm gonna foot stomp on that later on in the talk. Ships are modular. There's a ship that's damaged and it's put back in service relatively quickly. In fact, they make a point of saying that if it had been one of those Derringer or Dragon class heavy battle cruisers that had been damaged, they would have just scrapped it. But instead, it was a light cruiser that actually had this modular construction. So they just cut out the stuff that got melted away and rebuilt the framework that they had to rebuild, and then they plugged in new modules, and it was ready to rock and roll. A ship basically had its heavy amount of damage done to it, and it was in the yard for 6 weeks. In something that, like, if it had happened to a World War II light cruiser, it would have put them in the yard for a year. Instead, they were out in 6 weeks. Another thing worth pointing out is that ships in this universe are relatively small, and that actually kind of surprises me. They talk about, oh, these orbital forts. Oh my God, it's so huge. 1/4 of a kilometer, 250 meters. It's about 800 feet. Now, it's a big sphere, so it masses substantially more than, say, like a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, but a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier is like closer to 1,100 feet, like 1075. So lengthwise, it's shorter. And so you think of like Star Destroyers, you think of, you know, ships from Perry Roden where they end up being 5 or 6 kilometers in diameter and stuff like that. These things are all small. They talk about a blast ship, which is their equivalent of battleship. A blast ship being 400 meters long. And then there's some other indications that indicate that it might be around 40 meters in diameter. That's sort of extrapolating, taking a statement from here and a statement from there, you know, taking a statement from here and combining it with an actual size and sort of extrapolating it. But, you know, 400 meters, that's about the length of a Nimitz, you know, more or less. A little bit less, but not much. There's certainly super tankers that are bigger than that. There's certainly large container ships that are bigger than that. So it kind of makes me wonder. Now, that's not including the outriggers. You see on the right-hand side, I've got one of the book covers that shows what a blast ship looks like. It's got those outriggers. That's probably the stern of it, I would think. But the stern doesn't look like that either, but that looks closer to being like the business end of a propulsion system than it does looking like the nose, unless it's supposed to be the nose when it's open, because that's where the hangar bay is. And so the doors open, but the doors don't look like that either. So it's unclear to me exactly what the artwork is trying to do. It's also unclear to me. I know that the ship rotates, but the outriggers don't. And so it's unclear to me exactly how those outriggers are attached. There's some indication there might be a sleeve that goes over the cylinder, but I'm unconvinced that that's actually there. So, and I don't think all blast ships look like that, because the blast ship that you see at the derelict that you see at the very beginning of the first book is never described as having outriggers. It's described as being a cylinder, just a straight cylinder. Okay, so what do I think's missing with this? So first of all, I would expect there to be drop tanks, especially for the speeders. And we'll get into speeders in some detail later on. But there's situations where I would expect there to be drop tanks. And the speeders are specifically the most likely one. Automated ships, there's lots of places where I would think a robot ship would be useful. Some sort of drone ship would be useful. That kind of makes sense. Now, keep in mind these original books, I think the original ones were written in the 1980s. So, you know, if you miss automated ships today, it's a lot bigger sin than if you missed them back in the 1980s. I would expect there to be more specialty ships because there's some very interesting differences between the offense and the defense on this. We're going to talk about that when we get the fold space points. And it just makes me think that maybe you'd have ships that would be optimized for that. Scouting, that should be sensor platforms. So I always have to have at least one typo in there. It seems to me that there's some things that are listed as scout ships. You don't really know exactly what they are, but it seems to me that there's more like deployable sensor platforms seem to be a thing that would make sense for me. And then also carriers for these speeders that I've talked about, and I'm going to talk about that later on in some detail. Okay, so let me go through a brief synopsis, not as long as the last time, but I want to foot stomp on a couple of things that I don't think I did a good enough job with the last time. So let me try to do some cleanup and emphasize some stuff that are going to become important later on. So in Antares Dawn, what you have starts off with a supernova shockwave has passed through the Altan system. Alta discovers it's no longer isolated because the fold space point that went away when Antares blew up is now back 120 some years later, because they're 120 some light years away from Antares. Fold point returns. There is a blast ship that the crew is all dead, but its autopilot brings it through the system. They rendezvous with it, just manage to stop it, and first of all they know that the fold space point is now open again. So they're a cul-de-sac. They're the end of a line, but they can now get out of their system again. They go out. They discover that their mother planet had been evacuated because it was much, much closer to the supernova, and it had been evacuated, but it also had discovered an alien race that actually nuked them during the evacuation process. And while visiting another system that was also a daughter colony, that of Sandar, they discover that mankind is at war with a race known as the Ryal. Both sides initially are keeping some secrets, like the existence of that blast ship, which they figure out had come through the Antares Nebula, the remnant of the supernova, and hence the remnant of the supernova is now passable. Both sides come clean and they form an alliance. In the next book, they explore the Antares system. They figure out where the fold points are. They're looking to get back to Earth. They manage to capture some critical data. They capture a fold space topology chart of the Ryal Empire. So now they know what its fold space clusters look like, and they've got data on all the colony worlds that they've got, who produces what, and they've got their location and how to get to their fold points. They managed to find a path to Earth, and they propose to Earth. They propose an attack, and that initial proposal is deemed unworkable. The Earth says, no, that's not going to work because we know from the data you gave us that the Spica fold space cluster gives them such capability in terms of being able to maneuver their forces around the empire that you think, because they were going to have a diversionary attack come from one side that would pull forces in the system away, that would uncover the second fold space point in that system, and then Earth could come roaring through that fold space point. It's like, no, because of the Spica fold space cluster, our assessment is they'll just call home for reinforcements, so they won't actually denude the other fold space point. So your plan is based upon an incorrect assumption about how they'll reinforce, and as a result of that, the plan won't work. And so instead of us launching this attack, let's evacuate your planets because you're all cut off, and they're going to get you eventually. Let's go ahead and evacuate. They don't like that. Sandar and Captain Drake of Alta don't like that idea. So Drake manages to come up. He has a flash of inspiration, and he comes up with another plan. And that plan is, well, let's go for the gusto and take the Spica fold space cluster. Take the Spica system, which is the key to the enemy empire. If we can capture that, It's like capturing the Panama Canal, only more so. And then we'll be able to win the war. And so in the third book, Earth and its allies execute this desperate plan to win the war by attacking and fortifying Spica, which will cut their interior lines. They can blockade the key worlds of the Ryal Empire until their economy collapses, because their economy, the Spica fold space cluster, by virtue of how many nodes it has and how close together the nodes are, it has created a situation where they're basically have a tightly integrated economy, and by clamping down on trade between the various parts, their entire economy will fall apart. And so it's basically using the attributes of Spica that make it so important and such a force multiplier, using it against them by taking it away from them and making it a force multiplier for the humans. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about fold space, because I keep talking about fold space, right? I talk about fold points, I talk about fold space topology charts, and I talk about all these things. Let's talk a little bit about fold space. So in general, fold space lines are sort of, they describe it as being like you take a piece of paper and you crumple it up, and the creases are the fold space lines. They basically run from the black hole, the galactic center, outwards. And the lines are kind of running generally outwards, and so that they have a tendency to be biased in that direction, but they only are accessible when something like a star focuses enough of it together to create what's known as a fold space point. And if you've got a fold point, you can use that fold point to jump to the next thing along that path. And the way it kind of works is that you might have multiple fold points in a system. Each fold point only goes to one location, but some systems have multiple fold points, and so they're transit areas. It's like a train station. Others are, like Alta was a cul-de-sac. There's no way out. There's only one. And so the comment is made that only 5% of stars actually have fold space points. The majority of stars do not. And so, like, at one point they talked about this star that's just a couple of light years away, 3.5 light years away. And he said, no human has ever been there and probably never will, because as near as we can tell, it doesn't have a fold space point. And so we don't know how to get there. It's not one of the 5% that have fold space points. Which leads to some interesting possibilities, especially in terms of, like, because they don't go to the closest star. They follow these lines. And so, like, at one point, character makes a comment that in order to reach the star next door, it was sometimes necessary to first jump to 500 light years distance, then double back. Actually, that's not a character. That's McCollum. He explaining how it works. So, like, the next star over, I might have to jump to the other side of human space, 500 light years away, and then I go and I'm able to work my way back. And so you can end up with situations where empires are interpenetrated. In fact, you sort of discover that that's kind of what's going on here, is that the Ryal Empire is at least partially inside the human empire. And there didn't used to be connectors, but because of the supernova destroyed a bunch of fold points. It also created some new ones, some of which were temporary, some of which are permanent. And so you had these two empires that weren't even aware of each other's existence that now have border systems, and that causes a problem. So human space, it turns out, is about 500 light years long, about 200 light years in diameter. It's kind of strung out. And Antares was this big cluster on one side of it that had a lot of fold space points, but now it's gone. And so they talked about how there used to be, like, there was one particular star that had 6 different ways it could get to Earth, and now it's only got one, because all those other ones went through Antares. That was like the first step along the way. And human space being strung out, it's 15 transitions to get from one end of human space to the other. Ryle space, its empire is actually a lot smaller. It's only a third as big, but basically everything connects to Spica. There's a few back channel ways to get to places, but as a general rule, everything connects to Spica, and no Ryle planet is more than 3 transitions away from Spica. So do the math. That means going from one end of Ryle space to the other end of Ryle space is 6 transitions, not 15. Says there are 22 separate systems in the Ryle hegemony. Every single one of them belongs to the Spica fold space cluster. Every single one of them has a pretty direct line in. Can get to Spica within 3 jumps. And at some point they are calculating like what's the effect of that, and the answer is that it's a combat multiplier of 2.7. So in other words, 10 Ryle ships can do the work of 27 human ships in terms of the ability to respond to problems and reinforce, et cetera, et cetera. And so they've got interior lines. They can do more with less. And it's just humanity's a lot bigger. But and in addition to that, because they've got this comparative advantage in their internal economy, they're able to be a lot more efficient in their production. So they're smaller but more efficient, and they can move their stuff around more efficiently. It's like they've got a really good rail network and all the advantages of having a really good rail network versus being sort of kind of strung out. Okay, so here's a map from the 3rd book in the PDF edition. This is what the Antares and Spica fold space clusters look like. It's not everything in the empires. It's just the clusters themselves. And you'll see that Valeria is the star that the protagonist, Richard Drake, and the Discovery are from. They're from the planet Alta, which is around Valeria. Sandar is around Hellgate. Napier was closer to Antares. It was only 12 light years away, so it got pretty badly scorched. But Valeria and Hellgate did not. They survived. And in the Antares Nebula, there is now a connection that didn't exist before that goes to Eulista, which is one of the worlds within the Ryle hegemony. And I put a red circle around Eulista and Karatil because that's the path that they're going to attack when they try to go through to get to Spica. Those are the first 2 targets that they're going to go through there. So there's a quote on the right-hand side. The money shot is, "For with their short travel times, the Ryle have no need to defend in depth. They can concentrate their forces in those systems where they dispute with us. Should we open a new front anywhere else, it's a relatively easy matter for them to rush forces to the new battle zone." Humanity's having to reinforce and build forces and build forts and build defenses every place because it can't run fire brigades around to deal with problems. It's got to basically respond with the forces it has. The Ryle forces are able to move around. This is a very this is part of the reason why I'm so interested in this and why I wanted to talk about it, because this is just a really, really interesting situation here. You know, how do you deal with this situation? Let's talk about how they deal with this situation. But first, let's talk about fold points, because we talked about the fold space topology. So let's talk about the actual fold points within the system. They're described as being billions of cubic kilometers. They're described someplace else as being about the size of a planet. To be honest, I didn't figure out what the radius of a billion cubic kilometers, what that works out to in a sphere. They're not always spherical. Sometimes they're ellipsoid, but they're roughly the size of a planet. And, you know, how big a planet, right? Okay, Jupiter, Earth. I didn't bother to check any of that. That's just sort of the order of magnitude. They're fixed with regard to the star. So they don't seem to rotate around the star or anything. They're sort of fixed in the relationship to the star. There's no known instances of fold points occurring inside a star. but they say, but we don't know where we're going to get to when we jump into Antares. In fact, it was only the fact that the battleship made it through that led them to even try, because that was a pretty good evidence that maybe they can make it through. So they wonder if, like, maybe this will be the first time. Maybe we'll actually discover one that's inside a star, but it turns out, no, they don't. It can be focused by the star or other mass in the system. And so Antares had the new fold points in Antares, when they went and mapped them out after the fold space cluster opened up again, there was 4 fold points that were close in, and there were 2 farther away. And so the 4 close in were basically caused by the focusing effect of the star, what was left of the star, the remnant. The others were the focusing effect of the big diffuse cloud of gas, the outer layers of the star that had been blown off. They actually had collectively, the mass of that was able to focus some of this, and so you ended up with 2 far away, 4 in close, and they were far enough apart. They can be far enough apart that, like in this case, there's this example of it took them 3 weeks to get from one of the fold space points in the Napier system to the other fold space point in the Napier system. It took a full 3 weeks at 1/2 G, presumably with a turnover halfway through and then decelerating on the other side. So that gives you an idea of what the travel times look like. Now, Spica is a much bigger star, and it concentrates the fold points close in, and hence the fold points are actually closer to each other. And they talked about the fold space times being, transit times being substantially reduced. So you don't have this 3-week long journey. You've got a journey that's measured in terms of a couple of days to get between the various fold space points at Spica. And that turns out to be important later on when they need to deal, when they move into the system and they have to move forces around between the various blockading points. Okay, so how do you actually attack a fold point? And so let's talk a little bit about the nature of surprise. So the surprise is basically can be summarized as the when, the where, and the how an attack happens. You could be surprised by it not occurring when you think it's going to happen, or it occurring when you think it's not going to happen. You can be surprised at exactly where the attack comes in, or you can be surprised in how it happens. Now, in this setting, most of the surprise is what I would call tactical. You know where it's going to be. It's going to be at a fold space point. That's where the enemy ships are going to come in. You have an idea as to how it's going to happen. Things are going to come through the fold space. Now, there are innovations that occur. Like at one point, they managed to sucker the Sendarians to come in close, and then they dropped a big ass antimatter bomb in that blew away a bunch of the ships and blew away a bunch of the mines and stuff they had seeded the fold space point with. Later on, they start adding junk like oxygen and iron and other things that ionizes easily, and that has the effect of corroding the sensors and basically just making an opaque mass of plasma that they can't see through, in addition to the fact that it's attached to a big-ass antimatter bomb. And as a result, it has a tendency to sort of blow away all the mines and stuff that are in the fold space. So you can innovate, but you still know exactly where it's going to come in, et cetera. And so when is the only real variable, but they make, the characters are talking about it at one point. They said, well, you really can't catch a fold space point by surprise. You can't really catch because you know where they're coming through, and your assumption is they're going to come in at any time. So you're kind of always on alert, right? You staff it so that you can always be on alert. And so the result of this is you've got lots of automated defenses, lots of mines and stuff like that, and and everything is basically a set piece assault against a prepared position. Everybody's in the fort, everybody's manning the ramparts. You know that the attackers are outside and they're coming, and it's just a question of, like, is it now? Is it now? Is it now? But what ends up happening in this, because now the Antares fold space points are open, Antares is now traversable, and now there's a back door into the Ryle hegemony. They can actually achieve strategic surprise. The Ryle don't know there's a back door. They don't know about the where. They just don't know that there's a possibility of somebody coming in through the back door. And because they don't even know that that back door exists, they think it's a dead end. Because who's going to go into a supernova? You got to be insane to go into a supernova, right? That's unpassable. Turns out it's not. Because they think it's a dead end, they don't bother defending against it. There are no defenses on that fold space point. And so if they can get through that point, and they can get through the other points, and they can get to Spica, and they can take Spica, the fact that all the Spica fold points are close to each other just makes their job easier, makes it easier to blockade them, because they can reinforce each other. So Antares Victory is really a book about maximizing strategic surprise and how you go about maximizing strategic surprise. And that's one of the things I really love about that book. Okay, so I spent some time thinking about, where do you put the defenses in this situation, right? Okay, I've got a fold point. And let's say that a fold point has two sides of the fold point, right? There's the here side, and then I can do the jump, and I end up there. So where do I put the defenses if I want to defend a fold point? Well, if I put them here, I know that when the attacker comes in, they'll be in a very limited area. The nature of fold space transitions is that you're sort of, whatever formation you're in just goes to shit. You're just sort of randomly distributed about the fold space point. Now, this is where the billions of cubic kilometers come in. They say there are no recorded instances of two ships ever actually colliding, and coming in on top of each other, coming in close enough that they would automatically collide. But they also slow down to zero velocity, basically, when they get to the fold space point, before they do the jump through. And then once ships start moving, that can be a little dicey because they might be close to each other. But ships don't collide in that. But you do know where they are. You know that they're going to be in this limited volume, and you can put all your defenses around it, and you can point all the guns in and stuff like that. And you know that they're going to be coming in at relative zero velocity, but you're not going to see them coming until they get there, unless you've got sensors on the other side that jump in and let you know an attack's coming. I'll get to that in a moment. And if they break out, the defenses are in the situation where they have to decide, like, do I chase them or do I stay here and deal with the follow-on waves? And so that's actually why when Richard Drake leads the assault force through to Spica, they actually have it set up so that they have a quick reaction force. And so they've basically got one task force for each of the fold points. According to the numbers, they have a task force for the fold point they just came out of, which I wonder about. But I can see why it would make sense to defend your back door. Because if there is a breakout, which indeed happens in the book, if there is a breakout, you want to be able to prevent them from jumping through there and causing havoc in the rear area. So, okay, so it makes sense to have something there. But he sort of functioned as the free safety. He was flying around, he had a squadron of ships that would chase down anybody that got through. And the Ryle were able to do a coordinated attack they were able to organize something through the back channels. There is some pathway that's not very efficient, but they were able to get forces to come through three of the fold points at the same time. Some of them managed to get by the defenses. The defenses said, all right, we're going to hang here. They called for backup. And those forces immediately dived towards the star where they could do a rendezvous. That actually makes a lot of sense from how orbital mechanics work. Any course changes you make deep in a gravity well actually have more effect than if you're outside a gravity well. The math works on that. I don't understand why the math works, but the math works on that. And as a result, they ended up with a situation where the three breakout forces come behind the star and Richard Drake and his force come around the other side, and they do one of those. And the forces that are left from the Ryle side, both sides take it on the chin. The Ryle side gets it worse for wear, and as a result, they're not able to reinforce when the next planned breakout happens. Now, it's interesting, though. It seems to me that, that's if I put my defenses here, right? I put my defenses here. I got all those advantages of being on this side of the fold point. If I put them there on the other side of the fold point, then I don't have this limited area. They can come at me from all different angles, etc. But I can see them coming. I know they're coming. I can see them across the system. And so it would seem to me that if you had the option of at least having a picket force on the other side to let you know something's coming, you probably would. And it seems that as a result of that, that there's kind of two different types of star systems that we see that are border systems between the two worlds, the two empires. In some of them, you've got big fold space defensive points on either side of the fold space cluster, on the fold point, I mean. I've got my forces, the Ryle has their forces. We're both prepared for a ship to come through and ready to kill it when it comes through. Everything's highly, highly defended. But there's at least one system where they talk about that's not really how they've got it set up. Nobody's really claimed the system, and both sides sort of go through and raid the other. Okay, I'm not sure what raid the other means, because the humans definitely had fold space defenses on their side. On the here, they had fold space defenses. There was nothing on the there. So it seems like there was an empty system there, but what are you raiding? My guess is you're raiding each other's pickets, right? You have a ship on the other side. Maybe you have some sort of sensor platform on the other side that's taking a look at the entire system and telling you what it sees. And maybe you occasionally go in and blind the other guy. You poke out his eyes. That's the only thing that makes sense to me about that. So I can see a situation where, especially if your forces are you don't have a whole lot of forces, you might not have enough stuff to go through. Now, I'll note, you sort of compare and contrast with Mote and God's Eye, where things are far enough apart, and you specifically talk about there is piracy because you're not maintaining a watch on all these different systems. And in this one, there really isn't any piracy. If you know that there's a transitable that you can transit a particular fold point, you're not going to just not watch it, right? You're always going to have somebody watching there. You've either got inhabited systems that you've got stuff in, or you've got defenses of some sort. You'd think at the very least you would have a sensor that would be watching the entire system and telling you what's going on. So I don't see this as being a universe where there's a whole lot of piracy, unlike Mote and God's Eye, which seems to be more spread out. I think the Empire in Mote and God's Eye is bigger. It's just bigger. Okay, so what exactly is the strategic plan that the Earth and its allies are going to do? So the plan is as follows. Using the swanky anti-radiation fields developed by the Altons, of all people, and given to the Sandarians and to Earth itself, move forces through the Antares Nebula undetected. Not surprising they're undetected. The Ryle are beginning to send expeditions into the nebula. The Antares Guard Force immediately destroys them. And so as far as the Ryle are concerned, they think that the nebula is unpassable because every time they send a survey ship in, it doesn't come back. So the nebula must be a pretty hostile environment, right? And they specifically, the human side specifically does not send anybody through that fold space point, because if they sent somebody through and they got spotted, then they immediately know what's going on. So they just steadfastly destroy anything that comes through, but they don't give away their position. So move forces through the Antares Nebula undetected. Then they need to capture Eulista fast before warning can get out through its other fold point to the Caratal system. And then they need to capture Caratal fast before warning can get out to Spica. And then they go into Spica with some number of task forces. They originally talked about 10. I think they ended up sending an 8 or 9. Later on, when they actually do it, I think that's the number they end up with. And they're going to blockade those fold points. They're going to slowly move up the forts because the forts are slow, so they don't have an option of moving up fast. But they put several hundred ships in the system, lock down the system until the forts can get in place. And then once the forts are in place, they're really in good shape. And they just wait for the Ryal economy to collapse. And Ryal will eventually not be able to defend itself, and then they can go and sort of clean up the systems one at a time. So the key to this, though, is you have to get through the Ulysses system and get to the fold space point before anybody can get out to Karatul to spread the alarm. And then when you go to Karatul, you have to assault it fast enough that nobody can get the warning out the other fold point and get to Spica and alert the fleet, the Ryal fleet, that there's a problem. So how exactly do you go about doing that? And the answer is a ship called a speeder, which at least in my mind looks like a Hawk, a Mark 9 Hawk from Space 1999. So the situation is that Antares is passable, but the Ryal don't know it. It's a backdoor to Ryal space, and as a result, they can get to Spica. You need to achieve strategic surprise, so they've got something that they call the Mercury Force, which has these special ships called speeders that are designed specifically for this assault in order to maintain strategic surprise. They have extremely high speed. They talk about going 10 Gs, that they're expected that they're going to be going at 10 Gs. But at one point, one of the characters says something to the effect of, the engine is rated for 20. They're not quite sure whether they actually could do 20 or not, but in theory, the engine is rated for 20, and I think they end up doing 12, if I remember correctly. It's got a very small crew. I think it's 4, it might be 5, but I think it's 4 people on the crew. And it's mostly fuel tanks and weapons. And so the idea is they're going to launch these things across the system, and the goal is to intercept anything before it can get to the fold point and get out, by just having such incredibly high acceleration that it can just get there fast, because it's probably just a merchant ship. Why would you have a warship in this area where there's there's no threat? It's probably just a merchant ship moving at like 2 Gs, so I'll come slamming in at 12 Gs and I'll blow it up. And then some number of them will slow down and defend that fold space point until the slower main fleet units can get up there and sort of take the job from them. And if it turns out they get there and they can't get all the ships, and the warning does get out, their job is to die gallantly as the rear guard while the rest of the fleet retreats behind the fold space defenses that they have on the other side. So they'll basically at that point end up retreating probably through Antares to wherever it is. Or, you know, they'll maintain as far forward as they can, because like if it works at the first planet, first system, but doesn't work at the second system, they'll probably hold at the first system. But these are essentially one shot. The Mercury Force Alpha Squadron, they takes place in the first assault. They do not take place in the second assault, because the comment was made that their engines need a major overhaul, and that they're basically stuck tooling around being messengers until such time as they get a major overhaul. They're not necessarily a one-shot weapon, but they're kind of assumed to be. So how can the crew handle 12 Gs? In fact, they said, you know, at one point the crew person says, you know, something like, I'm not sure we could handle 20, but we could come close effectively. Well, first of all, they've got brain implants in their cerebral cortex that allows them to interface with the computer and use a synthesized voice to do radio calls and stuff like that and send information and control the ship. So they're not having stick and rudder stuff. They're doing everything with their minds. They're immersed in a bath of oxygenated fluid that fills up all their body spaces, et cetera, to protect them from acceleration. And their blood is actually oxygenated through a pair of tubes an incoming and an outgoing tube that plugs into their arteries by their thighs. And so there's an external system that's actually oxygenating them while they do these high-speed runs. And the way that they conduct this assault is 10 ships jump through. We see this happen in the first one. 10 ships jump through. 9 of the ships immediately tear off to do that mission of closing off the fold space points. One of the ships jumps back, gives a report, then jumps a third time back to the system, and then plays catch up with the other ones. Okay, that doctrine is broken in a couple of different ways. Remember that each jump takes 10% of your fuel? I talked about at the very beginning. Yeah, that's broken. Let's fix that. Okay, so the right answer, of course, is a battle rider. And this artwork here comes from Winchell Chung from the Atomic Rockets website. Winch, who was the designer of the original Warp War, he did the original artwork for the game Warp War. He has since gone through and 3D modeled all of it. And so that is a 3D model based upon artwork he did back when he was in like high school that got published in the game. So these speeders really should be battle rider. You should have a carrier that is delivering the speeders. The purpose of the carrier is the delivery of the speeders, and it can take like an entire squadron of speeders in one fell swoop, one jump that the carrier pays for. It's 10% of the carrier's fuel. So once they do the jump, the carriers disengage, or the speeders disengage, and they've all got full fuel tanks. And they immediately launch on their assigned missions based upon whatever initial tactical data they have. Meanwhile, a couple of things happens. The carrier deploys whatever sensor arrays it does and functions as a command and control node to sort of try to get a better view of what's going on in the system, right? They made the initial launch at the fold space points, but let's take a big sky sweep with a high resolution sensors, figure out what's going on. So it does that. And then it also has like messenger boats to send back to let the rest of the force know what's going on. The rest of the force doesn't immediately jump because it might be jumping into a trap, right? So that's part of the reason it doesn't jump. It waits for word that says, yeah, come on through. But I think that carrier jumps through, moves out of the fold point, assuming it's clear, deploys all of its sensors and starts sending messenger boats back saying, okay, this is what we found out. This is what we've launched according to plan. Coast is clear, come on through. Here's what and while they're waiting for them to come through, they keep sending messages back. So they've got like a handful of shuttles that they send back. And it either just stands there at the fold space point and functions as a command and control node in the fold space point, or maybe it starts taking off after its charges because it's got big ass fuel tanks and they're going to need fuel at some point. And it's a lot slower, but eventually it'll show up with fuel, and it's probably faster than the bigger tankers, the cryogen tankers that come through that are really pretty good size. So this thing is designed as sort of the intermediate fueler. This thing is designed as also being the tactical fueler. And so they, based upon what they see, is dependent upon what they do in that regard. So I think that's how this works. And I think, battle riders in Traveler, there's always this interesting, I love in-universe discussions. And there's an in-universe discussion in Traveler. There's a debate between the people in the universe who think that battle riders are great because they allow you to do a jump with and then deploy without having to carry around a jump drive. In fact, Richard Drake makes a comment about how the orbital forts are even more impressive when you realize how much of a ship is taken up by the photon drive and the fold space drive. And so These speeders still would have a photon drive, but they wouldn't need to have a fold space drive. And so they can carry even more fuel, even more ordnance. That's an important point that I forgot to put on this slide. But in Traveler, the battle riders, there's always this thought that, like, hey, if the battle goes badly, I'd like to be able to jump away. If I don't have jump engines, I'm going to die. And so that's bad. Well, this is a much different set of situation, right? I got to be at a fold space point anyway to jump. If I'm in the middle of nowhere and I'm losing a battle in the middle of nowhere, I'm not jumping anyway. And in this particular situation, if I'm racing to the enemy fold space point and I end up in a battle, I'm not going to go through that fold space point. That one doesn't help me at all. And so in this particular situation, the fact that I can't, I don't have a fold space drive to jump out doesn't hurt me in the least. It makes a lot of sense to not carry that extra mass around and to use it on fuel and weapons. And it makes a lot of sense to not use the speeder fuel to do that initial jump. Have somebody else pay that penalty. And, if you want to throw some drop tanks on this thing also, this is the place where you put the drop tanks. So, and next time, I'm going to go to slides and questions in just a second. But next time, Chris Carlson is going to be on the show and we're going to talk about modular ship construction and follow on to some of our previous work. And all this thinking about modular ship construction made me realize that I should probably do the Jovian Chronicles stuff sooner rather than later, because one of the things that's really cool about the Jovian Chronicles stuff is that those ships are indeed modular to the degree where DreamPod 9 included a page of just parts in the back so that you could photocopy them and cut them apart, and you could move the little parts around and make your own ships by moving these parts around. And in universe, the ship on the right, the Alexander class destroyer, didn't originally have that habitation ring. And when the Jovian Navy decided it was going to be a more deep space force and that they were going to have longer deployments and they realized they needed a hab ring, they took the ships apart and added this habitation ring. Now, if you are a Jovian Chronicles person, you're probably saying to yourself, but Chris, the image on the left doesn't match the image on the right. That's true. The image on the right is an Alexander class destroyer. The image on the left is a Forge class carrier. There's some differences in how those rings work and stuff like that. But if you look at the front view, the Forge class, what you are looking at the 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock position, what you are looking at is a habitation module that rotates 90 degrees based upon whether the ship is under thrust or not. And when it's under thrust, so it's set up so the deck is always down. So when it's not under thrust, it rotates 90 degrees and the entire thing spins, or it can stop spinning and orient in the direction where that when it's accelerating, when the engines are firing, that thrust continues to be down instead of out. And so I've wanted to talk about Jovian Chronicles and the modular ship design inherent in it and sort of how they do stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Problem is I need to read a lot about it. And there's not a whole lot of images on the web. There's some fantastic artwork. I'm going to have to get my scanner up and running because I'm going to have to scan it all in order to really do this justice. But I'm thinking that I probably need to do it sooner rather than later because of the modular ship construction stuff. Okay, so let's talk about questions. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of comments, but I'm going to go through them. So Patrick Ross asked the question, isn't a heavy battle cruiser basically a pocket battleship? Well, that's a very, very interesting question. So the short answer is maybe, but yes, but no. So pocket battleship, I don't believe is actually what the Germans called it. They called it something that basically meant specialized heavy cruiser, if I remember correctly. We called it the English and the Americans called it a pocket battleship because it had a huge amount of capability on a relatively small hull. And there's some question as to exactly what the Germans were trying to get to do with this. And there's actually one school of thought that says that there was a specific class of, I think it was Russian ship, if I remember correctly, that basically these things were intended for the Baltic. There was a specific class of ship that they were trying to defeat. And that, that happened with us. We built the Alaska class large cruisers, which some people call a battle cruiser. We never called it a battle cruiser. The Alaska class large cruiser was based on the idea that the Japanese were actually building an equivalent type ship, and we needed something to be able to fight it at the cruiser battle level. Because you didn't want to take ships out of the battle line to go do this. You needed to have a separate force that could go and fight that thing. And in a very interesting set of things, this sort of thing happened all the time back then. The Japanese looked at we looked at this one particular Japanese ship that we knew that they were working on, didn't know a whole lot about, and put 2 and 2 together and got 22 and decided that it was going to be this large cruiser-like thing, and we needed our own to go fight it. We need something that could outmass it, outfight it. At which point the Japanese looked at what we were doing with the Alaska class and said, "Oh shit, we need to beef up our thing." So their thing kind of ended up looking like ended up looking like what we originally thought it was going to be, but it was only because they were reacting to our counter to it. They were countering our counter. They weren't actually planning on doing it originally. They were countering our counter. Okay, back to pocket battleships and heavy battle cruisers and stuff like that. Battle cruiser is one of those terms that is used by different people to mean different things for different missions. In fact, you end up with interesting things like Alexander Clark on YouTube. He defines a battle cruiser as different from a battle cruiser. One word versus two. He thinks they're both separate things. And he defines the difference between a battle cruiser, I think in both terms, and a battleship in terms of their subdivision. Do they have certain cruiser-like attributes, or do they have battleship-like attributes? So he doesn't think in terms of the traditional, the Winchell-Chung triangle that I've put up. I haven't put it up in forever. And I should have put it up in this episode too, because it would have been useful when talking about specialized ships, et cetera, et cetera. So he doesn't think in terms of like it being the propulsion versus defensive capability, i.e. armor, versus offensive capability, i.e. guns. He thinks of it as being like how the structure is set up. What's the subdivision look like? I am not familiar enough with the subdivision of ships of that era to be able to assess that argument. I do know that he's the only one I've heard make that argument. And so, my take on naming and typing stuff like this is like naming and typing should be, the typing part of naming and typing should be about communication. And I'm going to have to define what I mean when I say cruiser, what I mean when I say destroyer, what I mean when I say guided missile submarine. I'm going to have to define that. And then once I've defined that, I can use that term and you will understand what I mean. I do not believe that there is a quote unquote right or wrong answer in how you approach that. Well, maybe I believe that there are some wrong answers. I don't necessarily believe there are right answers in how you approach that. In fact, I think you're much more likely to generate a wrong answer by being rigid about it. There are people that say, for instance, that the Iowa-class battleships are not really battleships. They're really battle cruisers because they do not meet the criteria of having armor that can defeat their own gun at such and such a range. Okay. First of all, that's a rule of thumb that the U.S. Navy used. Maybe the Brits did too, but primarily the U.S. Navy used, is sort of like okay, how do I think about this? What does a right answer generally look like? They had all kind of reached the conclusion that that's kind of the way it should work. You know that you've got a balanced design if you meet that criteria. So why was the Iowa class so unbalanced then? Well, it was unbalanced because after the design was made, the ordnance guys improved the shell. They didn't improve the gun. They improved the shell. And now the shell was better than it had been when they did the initial calculation. And so if you want to believe that the Iowa is a battle cruiser and not a battleship, you have to believe that when the ordnance people make a better weapon, it changes your ship designation. That doesn't make sense to me. Okay. Patrick also points out that even Traveler had drop tanks. Yeah, it did for the Gazelle class and some other things, and I think drop tanks would be useful. Let's see if okay, so Bob asked the question: if the enemy has ships near both fold space points, then what stops them from using lightspeed comms and sending the alert to the next system? Even 20G wouldn't be fast enough. You are correct, sir. And something I should have emphasized. So they capture this database that has the fold space topology chart, but it also has basically all the information about the different planets in the system. And they know that they're coming into a backwater system. They know that like one of them is an agricultural world, and the other one is just like a mining colony or something like that. This is not areas where you, and it's the back door, right? It's a cul-de-sac. There's nothing else there, right? So if you are in a situation where you think that there might be some chance that somebody's going to come in through the back door, well, first of all, you're going to put defenses there. But let's say, shit, I just figured out that this is potentially a back door. I'm scrambling to get defenses in place. I don't yet have defenses in place. What do I do in the meantime? I should put a picket there. I should put a picket on their side of the fold point and put one on at the other side of the system. And, don't put it right up against the fold point, because if bad guys come through the fold point, they'll immediately kill my ship if there's only one ship there. What I should do is put it far enough away. In fact, you don't even need laser comms at that point. I just need to, I go into I have a ship on the other side of the fold point, and I just have a big ass telescope, and I'm looking at the other fold point. Do I see anything? Do I see anything? Oh shit, I see something. I should run like hell and go tell them. They just didn't know that. And so they were pretty sure that the only thing that they were going to find is just basically like a freighter coming in, with the supply run, or to pick up mining products or whatever, that they knew that it was a very, very low traffic system, and they'd have to be really unlucky for them to be in a situation that there might be something in system, but they'd have to be really unlucky for them not to be able to catch it. And so they took the gamble, because it was a gamble, and the gamble ended up paying off, but it was a gamble that could win the war for them. Yeah, One Horse Shay says, define battlecruiser and battleship in regard to spaceships. The refit Enterprise was a battlecruiser according to the Klingons. Yeah, and that actually gets to my point. It's like the Klingon naming and typing system says that's a battlecruiser. Federation says no, it's not. Well, you guys have as a battlecruiser, right? The D7 was always famously considered a battlecruiser in the early canon sources. And so I kind of put this in the same situation as I do guided missile submarines. The way the intelligence community works on that sort of stuff is the intel community does red, not blue. So the Office of Naval Intelligence will tell you that the other guy's submarine is a guided missile submarine, but it has no ability whatsoever to talk about US submarines. If you used the ONI standards, the United States Navy has, at the current time, I believe, 2 attack submarines. That would be Seawolf in Connecticut. Jimmy Carter would count as some sort of special purpose, special mission submarine. And everything else in the fleet has dedicated Tomahawk launch tubes, dedicated vertical launch tubes, and as a result would be considered a guided missile submarine. Now, guided missile submarines, according to ONI, can have torpedo tubes and they can carry a lot of torpedoes. The important thing is, do they have dedicated launch facilities for guided missiles? And the Flight 3 LAs and all of the Virginia class meet that criteria of being a guided missile submarine. And plus they're either guided missile or ballistic missile submarines. But the important part is that that there's only 2 attack boats but that is not how the US Navy does its own typing when it talks about itself. The Chinese have something they call a destroyer. We call it a cruiser because it's so much bigger than most other destroyers. So we just decided, okay, we're going to call this thing a cruiser because it's so damn big. It is frequently the case, we famously changed the Ticonderoga class guided missile destroyer to the Ticonderoga class cruiser by crossing out DDG and writing in CG. That is the only design change that was made. The Brits, on the other hand, they've had situations where they've named stuff, and the Brits and other countries have had situations where they've named stuff like it's a destroyer, but they call it a frigate. And the reason why they do that is because it makes it look like they're saving money and that they're being frugal. So naming and typing is an inherently political act. And the important part, like I said before, is that you need to define your terms and use them consistently because you are trying to communicate with somebody. And I don't care what you call it, I'm going to call it something like that. And David Weber in the Universe actually talks about that. There's and I just loved it when I came across this because this is like straight out of the real world. The Havenites would call something there was a particular manticore, and the new manticore and destroyer. The Manties called it a destroyer because they did their typing based upon mission. So even though it was twice the size of any previous destroyer, they were going to use it for what they considered to be a destroyer type mission, and so they called it a destroyer. The Peeps, on the other hand, do everything purely by tonnage. And they looked at it and said, it's twice as big. It's a cruiser. It's not a destroyer. That's a cruiser. And they're both right because they were using different metrics, and those metrics were internal to themselves. And it's not like they were going to have some big fight over, you mislabeled your ship. They were having a big fight, but it wasn't over labeling of ships. And so from that standpoint, the important part is that communication take place. Okay, let's see. Alaska was a large cruiser, especially for the role. Yeah, we never intended to use it as a battle cruiser. We intended to use it to go fight other cruisers. We just we thought it needed bigger guns to go fight something else. And they thought about putting 16-inch guns on it and specifically decided not to, because in order for them to do that on that size hull, they would have had to drop the number of guns. And there was a calculation based upon what they thought the hit rate was going to be. And they wanted more tubes. And so as a result of that, they ended up with a unique ammunition supply. They were going to supply these things with 12-inch ammunition. Nobody else in the fleet used 12-inch ammunition. It was a unique gun. And because it made sense for the role that they wanted to do it for. But that's also the reason why they kept those things for, they got rid of them immediately after the war. They also had some other issues, like they only had one rudder. And so there were talk about turning them into guided missile platforms, but the comment was basically, look, we got a metric shit ton of ships. There's no utility in turning the one-offs. We got plenty of battleships. We could, if we're going to turn something a guided missile ship, turn the Iowas into guided missile ships. We got plenty of ships to turn into guided missile ships. There's no reason to do these special unicorn ships and turn them into it. And then they concluded they weren't going to turn anything into that. And so they just scrapped them. Patrick Ross says he thinks that one or more of the Jovian Chronicles writers had aerospace engineering degrees. I don't know if that's true or not, but a friend of mine used to hang with those people. I'll ask him. One Horse Shay says something about Starfleet battles. I cannot assess what you said. I'll take your word for it. Okay. Yeah, when the Enterprise refit was launched, it would honestly be a battleship, as the Federation class would be so undergunned compared to it. Well, okay, so that's another thing that's important. And when I talk about battleships, I frequently put up this picture that shows a World War I battleship or a 1920s era battleship next to the New Jersey. And they're both battleships, and one of them's twice the size of the other one. But they're both considered battleships. The Brits would change their designation back in the Age of Sail. At least they would change their designation over time, and you know, so it would go from being a first rate to a second rate or something like that. That's kind of fuzzy on exactly how that worked, because their system changed over. As a general rule, that system was pretty strictly gun related, but it did change over time, and there was something in there somewhere where they would downward adjust. They had some categorization scheme that they would use to let you know that, yeah, this is an old ship and it's kind of been downgraded from where it was before. And so I play around with stuff like that because I'm really, really anal retentive about stuff like that. As much as I said that it's all about communication, I like a system that is consistent, and, you know, submarines are named after cities unless they're named after states, in which case they're boomers. And, you know, I like the idea that there's a consistent approach to things. And if I ran the Navy, it would be, you wouldn't have any of this Seawolf, Connecticut, Jimmy Carter bullshit. Nobody has asked me to run the Navy. Their loss. Okay, yeah, Japanese aviation destroyer. In fact, Perun had a great comment where he talked about, and then the Japanese destroyer launched its F-35s like destroyers do. It was just fantastic. And so, yeah, it's there's just a whole bunch of politics in terms of how they do stuff like that. Now, they did have to make, when they got the F-35s and they decided they were going to turn those things into carriers and actually fly F-35s from it, they did have to do a lot of deck reinforcing, and the F-35 engine is particularly hot. In fact, I watched a YouTube video that claims that you can't fly F-35s off of the Fords because the Fords, they haven't made the mods yet necessary for the jet blast to not like melt holes in it. I don't think it will melt holes in the deck. It will put ripples into the deck. Ripples are bad on a runway. Okay, so now somebody has asked me to run the U.S. Navy. Thank you, Bob, for your vote of confidence. I eagerly look forward to you winning the next presidential election and appointing me Secretary of the Navy. So get on that. One Horse Shay said something about happened with the heavy cruiser in Star Trek 23rd century, 23rd Constitution and the 24th Ambassador with vastly different masses. Yeah, and so Star Trek is actually just a fascinating thing to look at for this particular subject, and that's because the U.S. Navy rides its ships hard, put them away wet. I mean, they're got all these weird stresses on the hull. It's 20 or 21st century technology, and they're immersed in one of the most corrosive substances known to man, the universal solvent, right? They're immersed in salt water. If you want to make water even worse for metal, make it salt water. And, you know, we ride them hard, we put them away wet, and eventually every, you know, X amount of time, we just have to throw them away. Like the Tychos are all leaving the fleet because the Tycho was really an overstressed hull. We did more with that hull than we should have. We put that really huge superstructure on it. And so we kind of wrote them hard and put them away wet. And all the turbines, et cetera, even if you wanted to keep them, you have to upgrade all the radars and you'd have to pull all the engines out because those turbines are all 30 or 40 years old at this point. And so we just get rid of them. But we can do that because the ocean never gets any bigger. Starfleet is dealing with a situation where it's constantly having to cover more territory than it did before. The Federation is getting bigger. The Federation boundaries are expanding. Its exploration program is extending out into space, literally. And as a result of that, it's a problem that just constantly gets bigger. So I think that one of the things that happens with that is that Starfleet is constantly getting bigger. And I think that Starfleet is a master of taking ships. You know, those Excelsiors used to be frontline and now they're not. But, you know, you don't always need a frontline ship. You can have them do the mail run. You can have them carry admirals around. They can still deal with pirates. You know, don't send a battleship or don't send a heavy cruiser to deal with a cruiser kind of problem or a destroyer kind of problem or a patrol frigate kind of problem. Excelsiors work like for that, and Mirandas work for that. And I also think that those lines are hot and they just keep turning out new ones. And I'd be willing to bet that the last Miranda was put out sometime in Picard, sometime during Next Generation's time frame, and that Miranda looks absolutely nothing like the Miranda that we saw in Wrath of Khan. That it's been, you know, it's basically the same hull, but everything else has been upgraded. And the only time when you stop upgrading ships, when you stop building new versions of the old ship, is when you reach the physical limits of it. Like, yeah, it just can't handle those engines. Or, yeah, we need something that's twice as large. And when you get to the point where, in order to make the fixes necessary to make it work, it's cheaper to buy a new ship, then you dismantle the old one, you scrap the old one, and you melt everything down and you use it to build the new ship. Or you demolecularize it and use it to build parts for the new ship. And so I think it's not like the U.S. Navy where we are constantly getting rid of ships because we build new ones and we stay approximately the same. I think it's a situation where the fleet's constantly expanding and ships might have a 100-year lifespan. So, One Horse Shay says that absolutely right in regards to the Miranda. Even the new Star Trek RPG extensively says what you're saying. Okay, so it's good to know that they're right. It's good to know that they're right. Okay, so let's see. I think with that being the case, I think we're at the point where we can stop. Let me make a quick note to myself, because I do want to update a couple of things here. And with that in mind, so thank you very much, everybody, once again, for spending your Saturday night with me, listening to me ramble about Star Trek and Michael McCollum and the Antares Trilogy and whatever. I really appreciate the fact that you were willing to come and do this. And so as long as you guys keep showing up, I'll keep doing it. Next week, I expect it will be Chris Carlson. I need to confirm that with him. I talked with him a couple of weeks ago about that, but I expect it will be Chris Carlson, and I've got plenty of other things to do. I want to do Jovian Chronicles. That's going to require some reading. There's a bunch of other stuff on the list there. I got plenty of things to talk to you all about. And at some point, I need to I'm still working on aircraft carriers in space and how to sort of put it all together and stuff like that. And so I want to take another run at that. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll see you next time.